Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I think
We
we
ready to
can,
go?
yeah, I think we can go ahead and dive right in.
All right, great. Well, first of all, thanks everybody for joining us. It's this is I know a comment. Talking about governance and talking about boards is one of those things where it's this great combination of the technical and the superhuman soft stuff. So I'll just acknowledge up front the topic is so large that we're only going to scratch the surface today, and I'm going to talk mostly about some of the bigger picture stuff about boards and about being a board member. And I encourage you, if there's some of the nuts and bolts stuff that you'd like to dive into, send in a question at any time, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. I'll try to address some of the questions throughout. And I encourage you just to engage, and if we don't get to your questions now, I'll follow up with as many of you as I can, because I know this is a topic where there's some implications that are generic, and we'll try to cover some of those ones that are universal, but there's also some stuff that's really particular to your organization and your board and your experience as a board member, or your experience as an aspiring board member. And I'll try to get to some of those on a personal level after the webinar. So why don't we just dive in? I'll talk a little bit about myself so that you know my background. Just make sure that this works here. Here we go. So I'm here wearing two hats. I've worked at the Rotman School of Management for the last 18 years. I ran a center called the Clarkson Center for Board Effectiveness up until about a month ago, when we launched a new center called the David and Sharon Johnston Center for Corporate Governance Innovation. Now, the Johnston Center, what we do is on the one hand, we're like a vacuum that just sucks up a bunch of data about boards. And on the other hand, what we do is we try to generate practical insights for boards of directors in all sectors. And we've got a special mandate to look at governance in what I call underserved models. So we've spent a lot of time in the past looking at big, widely held public issuers because the data is there's tons of it and it's easy to study. We're going to spend a lot more of our time over the next 5 to 10 years looking more at family enterprise and cooperatives and not-for-profit organizations and crown agencies and so on, because these are the models and the types of organizations that aren't getting as much attention and where we'd like to spend some of our energy. On the other hand, I wear a hat as an advisor. You see that logo for Fulbrook Board Effectiveness. And what I do in that role is I get inside boardrooms and work with boards and senior managers to try to understand what are the unique solutions that this organization needs in order to optimize the effectiveness of the board. So I've got these two hats, one on the research side and one on the advisory side, that sort of feed into each other. The data from the research gives me some really interesting research-based insights that I can bring into boardrooms. And the advisory side gives me an opportunity to kind of make that real by understanding how real boards work on the day-to-day basis. So I want to just really briefly for our agenda today, I want to talk a little bit about what is a board for in the first place. Because it's not always that obvious. And in fact, the answer is a little bit different from organization to organization. We'll spend some time talking about what makes the job of a board or a board member difficult, because it's not an easy role and it requires a huge amount of effort and time, and it requires a lot of willingness to take on accountability and liability. And finally, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about what you can expect when you join a board. And I imagine that some of you are already on boards and some aren't, but we'll talk a little bit at a high level about what to expect when joining a board. And I encourage you to send over some questions throughout that. And I'll maybe prompt you at a few points throughout the webinar to send in some questions on specific topics, and we'll take those up. And a little bit, we'll take them up throughout, and then at the end, we'll have some specialized time to answer questions. So I often, when I'm in a boardroom, the first question I'll ask, and I know it sounds a little bit condescending, but I'll ask a board, what's the point of a board of directors? Because it's not always that obvious. What happens usually when I'm when I'm in front of directors is there'll be either one of two scenarios. One, everyone will say, someone will put up their hand and say, the point of the board is, let's say, strategic oversight. And then someone else will say, yes, it's that and this other thing. And the next person will say, and this other thing. And then eventually we have this giant pile of things, and everyone agrees that we do all of that. Well, that makes it really difficult. If you've got 100 different jobs, how do you know what to prioritize, and how do you know where to spend your effort? And the other thing that sometimes happens is someone will put up their hand and say the point of the job is to, hire and fire the executive director, and then someone else will disagree, and the next person will disagree. And so it's either we've got an amorphous giant pile of responsibilities, or we've got disagreement. And I imagine if you ask this question in your boardrooms, you probably have a bigger discussion than you imagine. It's hard to get a lot of agreement on this question, and it's worth working through, because what you want at the end is some kind of, if not consensus, at least a philosophy about what's the purpose of this board. What are we working towards? How do we support our staff? How do we support the people that this organization benefits? And where does our role end is a very important question as well. We did a survey about, this is a while ago now, this is 6 or 7 years ago, and we surveyed 250 boards across all sectors. So this wasn't specific to the charity sector, but there was a lot of not-for-profit organizations involved. And there were only 3 things that every board agreed on that belonged to them and nobody else. That was, they're responsible for the approval of strategy, and we've got to pay attention that the verb was approving there. It wasn't developing or designing or overseeing. So this approving strategy was the only part of strategy that every board agreed on. They also agreed that they're responsible for hiring and firing the CEO or executive director. And they also agreed that they're responsible for setting the compensation of the CEO and executive director. Now, we all know that those aren't the only things that boards do, but the fact that there's only 3 things that all boards can agree on tells us something. And one of the things that tells us is that every board has a different type of role. You get into a boardroom, it's not always going to be predictable exactly what that board will spend time on and exactly how they'll do it. And you can count on these 3 things being on the agenda, but just about everything else, it's dependent a little bit on the organization and the people in the room. If we ask the question, what else is there, or what else could there be? I made a list here, but it's not exhaustive. Most boards will approve budgets. Some of them will be involved in setting the budgets. Most boards do something to oversee the performance of management and managing the performance of the organization. Most boards will be responsible for the oversight of finances and audit. Most boards will be responsible, or at least involved in the development and oversight of the mission and vision and planning according to the mission and vision. Some boards involve themselves in community engagement. Some involve themselves in recruitment of board members and fundraising, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want to stop on that fundraising piece for a second, because this is a little bit of a provocative topic for boards in the not-for-profit sector. And, a lot of the time, boards will either be 100% adamant that that part of the board's role is we must do fundraising, and some of them will say no, it's absolutely not the board's role. Now, the reality is the board isn't inherently responsible for fundraising or for going out to their own networks and raising money. It's not part of what their legal duties are. The board, however, as we'll see a little bit more in a second, the board does have the authority to determine what its purpose is. And one of those purposes can be fundraising, and in some cases it's not. So I know that it's a provocative topic. If someone has any specific questions about fundraising, please feel free to write them in now, and we'll see if we can address them a little bit later on. I used to get asked very frequently to give a recommendation of what a good governance model looks like. And I don't really have an answer. I didn't then, and I still don't, because governance models can be as unique as organizations. But what I did do is I drew this illustration here that you can see. Looks like a bullseye that sort of illustrates a generic or typical governance model for any type of organization. And what you see here, that outside ring that says external stakeholders, to make a very simple explanation, let's say if this was a corporation, that would be shareholders. For not-for-profit organizations, sometimes that external stakeholder group is a little bit less easy to define. It could be a community, it could be some group of stakeholders that to which the organization is responsible, or we could define it more generally as the corporation or the organization itself. Then inside that, we've got the board of directors, and then in the center, we've got management team or senior staff. Now, what's important here is we see the delegation of authority goes from outside to inside. That means those external stakeholders delegate authority to the board, which delegates authority to management. And what's important here, and that sometimes boards forget, is that the management team, and this is what it's illustrating here, the management team doesn't have any authority other than what's been delegated by the board of directors. Now, for some charities, some not-for-profit organizations, this is obvious. We know there are a lot of cash-starved charities where they don't have money to have staff, and in fact, the board is responsible for running the organization. And if they were to hire staff, then the board would delegate some authority to them. For larger organizations, it's a little bit easier to forget that, in fact, management only has the authority that the board gave them. And so, what happens sometimes, I'm sure some of you that are watching this webinar right now have experienced a situation where the board sometimes feels like the authority runs the other way, or that the executive director believes they're, for lack of a better word, the boss of the board. Well, that's just factually not true. The board has delegated authority to management, and the board is, in other words, the boss of the executive director. And the accountability flows the other direction, meaning management is accountable to the board, and the board ultimately is accountable to that external stakeholder group. This is just a useful illustration for us to remember, where does the flow of authority go and where does the flow of accountability go? I've noticed over the years that, and this has changed a little bit over time since I started working with boards almost 20 years ago, that there's sort of a spectrum of the level of depth that boards engage at. So I've defined this spectrum as the hands-off board and the oversight or governance board, and then the managing board. What we've got here, the hands-off board, and I'm sure a lot of us have seen this, is that's the type of board where they go in and they're just a rubber stamp, right? They exist only to fulfill statutory requirements, meaning they have to be there. The staff brings in their own recommendations, and the board doesn't discuss them much, and they just rubber stamp it. Maybe they're fundraising, but they certainly don't engage in a very deep level of decision making. Now, we've got a question on this fundraising point, and I want to address it now because I think that it is an important topic. So the question was, how can we get boards to engage more in fundraising and create a culture of philanthropy? And should board member donations be mandated? Now, this is a really, it's a more difficult question than it sounds. The role, as I said before, the role of a board, technically speaking, it's not mandatory for the board to be involved in fundraising. And in fact, as far as I know, you can't work that into formal bylaws to require boards to bring donations in. And if there are lawyers on the webinar, you can correct me. But so this really is, and I think the question was articulated well, it really is about creating a culture of philanthropy. Now, I remember I spoke with a very prominent board chair who was involved with an arts organization that was desperately cash starved, and he said, look, what we did was we were prompted by the fact that we were in crisis to start thinking about ways that the board could be involved in fundraising, and we all just sort of felt like it was our duty, because we have a duty to the organization, to open our own pockets and open up our own networks and get them involved in fundraising. Now, that obviously is not a situation most of us want to be in. And I think the question is more, how do we engage our board in a culture of philanthropy when we're not in crisis? And I think that a lot of the time this starts with the board chair or some other person in a position of influence being that sort of example. I see this a lot, not just when we talk about philanthropy at the board level, but when we talk about a lot of other governance-related topics, is that it's often led by the chair and the executive director sort of coming up with a way to engage and a way to lead by example. Maybe they start a sort of annual campaign. Maybe they start they make their own contributions that sort of show that it makes a really big difference to the organization for people in a position of leadership to be involved in that way. Now, I want to caution, if you require your board or your board members to contribute significant amounts of fundraising dollars, you exclude certain types of board members, and clearly what I'm talking about is people who can't afford to give, from eligibility to serve on your board. And we'll talk a little bit more a bit later about the importance of board composition. And I think it's important for your boards to acknowledge the fact that you have to be really open-minded about what I'm going to call more generally diversity in the boardroom. Do you only want wealthy people in the boardroom? Is the only purpose of your board to raise money? If so, it's going to be really difficult to engage your board in a broader level of decision making if they feel like their main purpose is to bring in money. So we can talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We had a follow-up question about a minimum dollar level for donations, and again, we've seen it work, and I know that in this, especially institutional nonprofits, where they really are able and willing to attract very wealthy board members, a minimum dollar level can be something that's functionally appropriate. For the typical charity organization that maybe doesn't have access to people with the same level of wealth, it may be more practical to attract people who have deep community ties and can engage your community in fundraising rather than opening their own pockets. We'll talk a bit, as I said, we'll talk a bit about a bit more about that in a minute. So I want to talk a little bit about that managing board at the opposite end of the spectrum. We were talking a minute ago about the hands-off board that exists only for the rubber stamp. The managing boards are a lot less common than they used to be. The managing board is a board that comes in and they're actually responsible for running the day-to-day operations of the organization, meaning that they don't have staff. And we, as we said before, we all know small nonprofits that don't have a lot of money where the board is responsible for running the organization. This is not nearly as common as it was, and it's not usually a state that most organizations want to stay in. Those organizations are this either happens because there's no money, or because there's crisis, or because the executive director has left unexpectedly, or some other sort of temporary situation. What most boards really want to stay at in most cases is this governing or oversight board. And what the role of that board is to develop and approve strategy, to oversee the CEO or executive director and their recruitment and evaluation and succession, compensation, managing risks, monitoring organizational performance. This is that board where many of you have probably heard the expression noses in, fingers out, and what it implies is that board, most of the time, rather than being involved in day-to-day operations, rather than running the organization, rather than making micro decisions, they're going to be involved at a much higher level, and their responsibility is going to be much more strategic and much more of an oversight role rather than an ongoing operational role. And this is where most boards today exist and operate. There's a really significant and important question that I ask boards, both in the classroom and in boardrooms, and I actually run an exercise with them. And the question is, to whom as a board member do you owe a duty? Now, there's a lot of ways that we can think about this question. I usually don't give them any context. If I meet a board for the first time, I'll give them this question. I'll ask them to go out in groups without any guidance and try to answer it. And they come back with a huge variety of answers, because some of the board members will interpret duty as a legal duty, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Some of them think about it as a moral or ethical duty. Some of them think about it as a duty to the mission of the organization. There's a lot of ways to interpret this, and it's important to acknowledge, in my opinion, all of those types of duties. Because if we only interpret duty as a legal thing, we sometimes miss some of the nuanced opportunities that our organizations have. So, for example, in Canada, every board has a primary legal fiduciary duty, and I'll take a step back. In case any of you are not sure what a fiduciary duty is, a fiduciary is someone who is in a position where they have been they've been in a position of trust to look after the interests of someone else. And so in this case, the board in Canada, the primary legal fiduciary duty is to, quote unquote, the corporation or the organization. This is true for a large public entity as much as it is for a small community charity. And what that means is that you are as a board member, your primary duty is to look out for the interests of the corporation or of the organization. Now, what does that mean? That means that let's think about it. I'll make up a situation on the spot. We can all think of, no matter what type of organization we have, if we think about the people who benefit, let's say it's the community. The interests of the community are not always directly aligned with the interests of your organization. So, for example, you may have an opportunity to do something that will create short-term benefit for your community at the expense of the long-term interests of the organization. So, if you spend you've got $10,000 right now that we can spend to benefit the community for the next week, or we can invest it in the long-term health of the organization. It's actually very complicated for a board of directors to make a decision as to what the right approach is, because we've got a really interesting opportunity in the not-for-profit sector. Let's say that you've got the purpose of your organization is to cure cancer. In a way, the purpose of your organization is to die, right? If you have completed your mission, then there's no longer, your organization no longer has a purpose. This is, in a way, a privilege that most for-profit organizations don't have, which is a privilege to achieve a mission and then it's done. And so this is where the question of to whom do we owe a duty becomes really complicated for certain not-for-profit organizations and charities, in a way that it's not complicated for-profit organizations, because you may say, well, we've got this $10,000 on the table and we owe a duty to the corporation. And the purpose of your corporation is to end poverty or end cancer or have some specific end goal. It's very difficult to think about whether we invested in our community or whether we invested in our organization. So I wrote on this slide, why and when does this question really matter? I encourage all of you who are on boards, when you've got a really significant decision on the table, ask this question. And I mean, really deliberately ask the question. Before you start talking about how you're going to make the decision and the nuts and bolts of what's behind it, sit back and ask the question, okay, before we explore this decision, to whom do we owe a duty? Not everybody in the boardroom is going to agree. What you should try to do is rank it. You know, we owe a duty. Well, let's make a list. The people who stand to benefit or lose from this decision, let's make a list of them and let's rank them. I know that it's not perfect, but it helps to articulate in the boardroom then and there, you know what, this is the stakeholder to whom we owe the greatest duty right now and who stands to benefit the most or lose the most from this decision. So as we talk through it, we've got a little bit of guidance as to where we want to prioritize our attention. Now, I think it's probably worth taking a second. I mentioned the fiduciary duty before. Let's take 2 seconds to talk a little bit more. I'm not a lawyer, so I'll preface with that, but let's talk about what that means. One of the pieces that's not always clearly articulated to board members before they join boards, and this is particularly true in the not-for-profit sector, is that there's a lot at stake, not just that it's a difficult job, but that you are personally liable as a board member for the decisions that you make. So if things go wrong and the organization gets sued, you theoretically have your personal assets on the line. And I'm not saying that to scare you. In fact, there are types of insurance that will cover you, and it's extremely rare in Canada for lawsuits to actually affect the bank accounts of directors. But I think it's important to illustrate the fact that being a board member is not just a figurehead role. In fact, you ultimately have the authority and accountability for the decisions that are made at an organizational level. And the law outlines some of the ways where you need to discharge that duty. One of them is called the duty of care, which can be broken down in a few different ways. You've got to act honestly. You've got to be diligent and make sure that you're doing your job to the best of your abilities. You are responsible to actually act, because inaction in important cases is potentially you'd be liable for not acting. And you've got a duty to be obedient to the organization and read the appropriate information and pay attention to your governing documents and so on and so on. The other side of your legal duty is the duty of loyalty, which is really just a duty to act in the interest of the organization rather than in your own self-interest. And it doesn't mean that you can't have conflicts of interest in the boardroom. So, for example, if you're if you're on the board of a not-for-profit organization that benefits a community that you live in, that doesn't preclude you from being on the board. You're still allowed to be involved in conversations that may potentially benefit you and your community. You just need to make sure that you articulate those potential conflicts and recuse yourself from decision making where you feel like those conflicts might make a material impact on the way that you involve yourself in the decision. But these are really important things to remember because as I said, the being on a board is not just something you put on your resume, and it's not just a figurehead position. It's much more than that. You have ultimate authority and accountability for the decisions made by the organization. I often ask this question when I'm in boardrooms. I ask the question, where does your board typically operate today? And I ask people to write down a number, and the number would be on a scale of 1 to 10, from deeply operational to highly strategic. Any of you who are on a board now, why don't you just take 5 seconds and think about where you'd fall on that scale and write it down. We won't take it up for every single person who's on the call, but I think it's worth thinking about it. And we'll ask another question in a second once you've thought about it. The next question is, where should your board typically operate? And it's on the same scale of deeply operational to highly strategic. And once you've taken a second to think about that, it's not going to surprise you that most directors and most boards will have on that first number, this is the where does your board typically operate today, will be closer to the deeply operational level, and where should your board operate is usually closer to the highly strategic level. And why is that? It comes from a lot of different drivers. One of them is that we just as human beings are very, very curious about the details. If our executive director comes into the boardroom and gives us an update on something that's happened over the past month, it's often going to be our natural inclination to just ask about, tell me more about this number in the financial statements, or tell me more about this complaint, this really specific complaint that we got from one person in our community, or, diving into these things that are emotionally tangible. And it's also partly driven by the fact that the presentations that we get from our staff are often really deeply focused on the past. They give us updates on what's happened, and they often don't ask us a lot of questions about where things are going or should go. And that invites us to spend a little bit more time, as we say, in the weeds, asking about the nuts and bolts of operations. So the board and management sort of both play a role in keeping the board a little bit more to the left-hand side of this scale. Where boards often want to be is in that highly strategic side. So asking probing questions, looking toward the future, trying to make plans and making sure that the organization is positioned for the best opportunity to be successful. And that's very difficult because, well, for a lot of reasons, which we'll explore more in a second, but the biggest thing is that boards are just not there enough. And I'm not saying that they should be, but the reality of a board is you've got sometimes quarterly meetings, sometimes monthly meetings, and you're there for a few hours, and that's all you get. And so we've got this deep, deep drive to become more involved and ask really specific questions. I just got a question here about bringing us back to the duty piece. One of them was about asking if the board should always have insurance. So the short answer is yes, and the longer answer is there's a type of insurance called directors and officers liability insurance. It is not particularly cheap, although there are often special rates for not-for-profit organizations. But I would say that if I was being asked to join a board of directors, I would be very wary of joining if there was not directors and officers liability insurance. It's a low probability that the organization would get sued in a way that would affect the board. And even if they did, it's a low probability that the board's personal assets would be at stake But despite the fact that the probabilities are low, it's still possible. And I think that it's a very wise investment for a typical organization to make sure that there's directors and officers liability insurance. So first of all, you can make sure that your board is covered in case of these unlikely scenarios. But second of all, it helps you to attract better board members, especially ones who would ask that question and would be unlikely to join the board if they weren't covered. We had another question about the duty piece, asking what if we see the board making unethical decisions? And that it's such a big question that it's hard to give a generic answer, but I'll do my best. If the decisions are unethical in a sense that where it's criminal or illegal or close to it, then I certainly would. I would make sure that it gets investigated with all due diligence with respect to the law. If we're talking about something a little bit more nuanced than that, it's a difficult question because, the decision itself that comes from the board should be a decision that's made by a collective of people, right? So you've got somewhere between 5 and 15 people in this room who have collectively made a decision that you've deemed to be unethical. That suggests a really potentially significant misalignment between the board and the interests of the organization. I would encourage, if you're asking this question from the position of a staff member, I would encourage you to connect directly with the chair of the board and have a conversation about this. The interface between the executive director and the board chair is an extremely important one, and one that needs to have a significant amount of trust between them. And I think that you should, as staff, you should not be afraid to, I was going to say confront, but maybe that's too dramatic a word, but you should not be afraid to approach your board chair and have a conversation and say, look, here specifically are my concerns. This is why I think it's unethical, and see what comes out of that conversation. If there's no solution there, or if there's no desire to move, and you really are convinced that the board is behaving unethically, I think you have to think really seriously about whether or not you want to continue to be involved in the organization. If the comment is being made from the perspective of a board member, in a way it's similar. I think you need to make sure that you've got a committee. Often this is the audit committee who as part of their responsibility, they've got the duty to oversee the ethics and decision making of the organization and overall enterprise risk for the organization. And if there's a specific decision where you think there was something unethical that was done, you'd have the audit committee specifically investigate or take a deeper look into that decision and come back to the board and report and make a recommendation as to what should be done going forward. And again, if you really truly believe that the board, after due investigation, is continuing to be unethical, then you'd have to consider really seriously your desire to be involved in the organization on a longer term basis. So I mentioned before this noses in, fingers out thing, and this is related to this question. And I'm willing to bet that most of you had, as I said, on this scale, you were a little bit more towards the left on your where does your board operate today, and you were a little bit more towards the right on where should your board typically operate. And if we think about this noses in, fingers out question, when is it appropriate? And the answer is most of the time, not always. So the boards should, in most cases, in a typical case, try to spend most of their time at that oversight level where they're doing what I call governance, as opposed to, making operational decisions or actually running the organization. There are, of course, situations where noses in, fingers out doesn't make a lot of sense. For example, if you've unexpectedly lost your executive director, let's say they won the lottery and they left today, and you weren't prepared for succession. You don't have anyone on staff who's really prepared to step in. It is, in fact, the board's obligation to make sure that the organization is sufficiently well run on a day-to-day basis. And it doesn't necessarily mean that one of the board members has to step in and be executive director. In fact, it may be a responsibility that the board takes on collectively But it is the board's responsibility to, in those moments, say, you know what, we need more than our noses in. We need to get in there and make sure that our organization is going to survive. Let's run it, and let's run the organization ourselves until we feel like we've got an appropriate successor in place. That's just one example. It doesn't always have to be driven by crisis, but there are definitely situations where it's appropriate for the board to be a little bit more engaged or a lot more engaged. And I sometimes push back on board members who say, no, that's not the board's job. Sure, that's sometimes maybe true, but there are situations where the board's job needs to expand dramatically and hopefully temporarily. So I want to just take a second, because I spend a lot of my time doing research and trying to communicate things in as easily digestible a way as I can. I've divided what I think makes boards' jobs difficult into 4 categories. One of them is that we've got such a limited amount of time. I mentioned before that we meet, at most 12 times a year in most cases, and in a majority of cases much less than that. And our meetings are, let's say, a couple hours long. How do we make sure that in that really small amount of time, we are getting everything done that we need to get done, especially considering that we have the ultimate duty for the appropriate execution of the organization's responsibilities. We've got ultimate authority and ultimate accountability, and we need to discharge it in a small number of hours per year. One of the other challenges is making sure that we have the right people in the room. One of the things that I've noticed is no matter how much effort that boards put into the development of effective processes, practices, policies, and so on, it doesn't really matter if you don't have the right people in the room. And it can be a really difficult challenge, especially in a volunteer situation, to attract and motivate the right people to be on the board, and even more importantly, to be engaged once they're there. Information asymmetry is another very, very significant piece. So if we think about that small amount of time that boards spend, I think it was Korn Ferry did a study a few years ago where they found that the average board member in a corporate setting spent 300 odd hours a year. I know that's a lot for most nonprofits, but 300 odd hours a year compared to 3,500 hours a year for a CEO. And what that means, and it's similar for an executive director who in a lot of cases that's their full-time job every day, all day, whereas the board is there 4 to 12 times a year for a couple hours. How do we make sure as a board that we have as much of the important information from the executive director and the organization as possible in order to make the decisions that we need to make? And the gap and the asymmetry of information is very difficult. It's never going to be fully bridged, but it's an important one for us to spend some time on, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then finally, the fourth thing that makes boards' jobs hard is this external, unexpected stuff. So maybe it's regulatory or political, maybe it's something from your community, maybe it's a change in funding, stuff that you can't necessarily control that comes at you in an unexpected way from the outside. So I want to talk about the information asymmetry piece we sometimes refer to as the information chasm or the information gap. The question is, how do you make sure that the board is fully informed but not overburdened, right? So as board members, we haven't signed up for this to be our full-time job. We don't have time to put in 10,000 hours on this. We've got, maybe if we're lucky, a couple hundred hours a year, a few weeks a year, where we can dedicate to the board. So how do we make sure that we've got as much information as possible without it being too much of a burden? And so I talked about that gap in the hours that get spent by directors and CEOs. This is what we call the information chasm, or at least it's one illustration of it. Some of the things that boards do to try to bridge that chasm. A lot of boards now hold retreats where once a year or more they'll get together and just talk about strategic stuff, talk about that higher level stuff that we don't have time or the opportunity in our regular board meetings to cover. There's a lot of opportunities now for directors to do continuing education, which can range anything from spending time with me for an hour on a webinar to taking a course for a few weeks to going to conferences. Boards hire independent auditors and consultants to provide them specialized information and advice. there's a lot of different tools that boards have at their disposal to try to close that gap, but it's never completely bridged, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, the CEO or the executive director is there to run the organization. It's to be expected for them to have more information. But the question underlying this is, what does your board need to know, and when does it need to know it? And we got a question a minute ago, what do you recommend that the executive director includes in board reports? And the answer to that question, I hate to be the researcher who just says it depends, but it really does. I would say that if we think about the reports as falling into several categories, one being the pre-meeting reading materials, one being the presentations during meetings, and one being sort of ad hoc interaction between meetings, each of these different buckets is going to have different types of content. So if we think about the pre-meeting materials, the pre-reads, I would usually recommend that the executive director and staff would include as much information as possible in the pre-reads, and the board should have reasonably high expectations of the board members to read and consume a lot of information before meetings and to be prepared, because the presentations during the meetings, boards and managers get much more out of them if they don't have to rehash the content of the pre-reads. So, for example, if you've got board members who tend to come in unprepared and need to have a lot of the content from the pre-reads covered in the board meeting, that actually sets the board back quite a lot, because you end up having to spend time in board meetings covering material that you could have just read in the first place. So if you get to that point where you can trust your board members to come in fully informed and only have questions that are substantive and about the future and sort of pushing management in ways that are more about strategy, then the presentations during board meetings, that second piece, can be more about thinking about the future. So I often will recommend to the executive director to include in the pre-meeting materials really provocative questions for the board. So rather than just giving a dump of information, include in addition a summary of what you think it means and why you care and why the board should care, and some questions about what's keeping you up at night and what do they think is important. And the executive director can provide sort of that open-ended, provocative platform so that when you get into the meeting, the board's already thought a little bit about what they want to talk about with respect to strategy in the future. And it also helps to get the board used to having open discussions and asking provocative questions. And that interaction between meetings, I know that this can be a little bit, some executive directors and some boards like to limit the amount of interaction between meetings, first of all, just to save time, and second of all, to make sure that all of the board members have access to the same information, or as much of the same information as possible. I still do encourage most of the time for the staff to engage with the board as much as they feel comfortable in between meetings. First of all, to make sure that they're in the loop, but second of all, to use them as a bit of a sounding board. There's no reason why the board's role needs to end the moment that the board meeting is done. These are very intelligent, very committed people who have the opportunity to provide support, provide guidance, provide even mentorship. And so I usually encourage boards and management to be a little bit open-minded about how they can interact with each other in between meetings to make sure that they've got the opportunity to bridge the gap as much as possible. And the information gap is so big in most cases. I took this circuit diagram. This is what tends to get boards into the details, because the gap is so big that the board wants to ask lots of nuts and bolts questions. This is why management has that opportunity to guide the board a little bit different by asking high-level questions. And so the information gap and noses in, fingers out are connected. I want to take a minute before we flip over to the question and answer period to talk about the time allocation in meetings. I just have a few, what I think are reasonably simple, but more importantly are free recommendations as to how boards can spend their time a little bit more efficiently in board meetings. One is, there's many of you will know, there's a device called a consent agenda. What a consent agenda is it's a document, a tool where you can combine non-controversial items like the approval of minutes, for example, into one approval item that you just, instead of having to talk about it and have a separate motion at your board meeting for all these routine stuff, pile it all into one tool, the consent agenda, and at the beginning of the meeting, just get all of it off the table at once. So if you're not familiar with consent agendas, I just take a quick Google search, and I highly recommend that even the most basic board operations, I recommend that you use consent agendas. If you're having trouble focusing on the strategic items, schedule them at the beginning of the meeting, because what happens to the stuff that's at the end of the meeting? Well, of course, it's the stuff that you run out of time on and you don't end up paying attention to it. Put the important forward-looking stuff at the beginning, and you'll spend more time. I often recommend that boards track and record the actual time they spend on agenda items. So what this requires is, first of all, on the agenda, or it doesn't have to be physically written on the agenda, but whoever is in charge of the agenda should have a very specific idea of how much time they want to spend on each item, and then actually track the time that you spend. A lot of the time, what you'll find is that you're not spending the time the way that you hoped you would. And by tracking it and monitoring it and then having a discussion with the board about it afterward, it gives you an opportunity to say, okay, here's what went well at the meeting, here's where we went over time, here are the things that we spent more or less time on than we wanted to. How do we want to do it differently at the next meeting? And then what's important is to change and deliberately at the next meeting adjust the way that you're spending your time and keep on tracking it. Because once you've hit that point where you're happy with the way your time is being spent, it's easy to fall back into old routines. Keep on tracking it and talking about it. Finally, a couple of last pieces. Allocate at least a couple of hours for board meetings. I know this is more common now, but it used to be that a lot of organizations would only allocate an hour, and they had a lot of trouble having the time to spend on strategic items. And we've done some research that shows that even one additional hour increases the amount of time that you allocate to strategic items by a very significant amount. So if you've got a 1 hour board meeting, definitely consider making it 2. If you've got 2, consider making it 3, and think about how you might use that extra time to focus the board on big picture strategic oversight. And then finally, this is really important, give the board at least 1 week in advance to read the pre-meeting briefing materials. If they don't have enough time, they're unlikely to come into the room prepared. And if they're unprepared, you end up spending a lot of your time reviewing material that they should have been prepared for already. Now, I had a couple of additional slides, but I want to make sure that we give some time for Q&A. And so I'll get back to the slides if our questions focus on some of these topics. So we'll give you time for Q&A now, but I want to point your attention. I put my email address at the bottom here. It's matt@boardeffectiveness.ca. If we don't get the chance to get to your question today and you really want to chat about it, email me directly. I am more than happy to chat with you and talk about whatever topics you're interested in with respect to boards and governance. So I will leave it to Marina, I think, to direct me on this Q&A.
Wonderful. Thanks, Matt. Lots to think about here for sure. And thank you to everyone who's submitting your questions. Keep them coming. So Matt, let's dive right in. For new directors, let's talk a little bit about maybe folks that haven't joined a board yet. What questions should they be asking before they go ahead and accept a director position?
Yeah, so I would sort of divide this, and I'll try to be as short-winded as possible here. I would divide the answer into a couple of different things. One being the nuts and bolts stuff. So I would definitely ask, like, tell me about the calendar. How much time do you expect of me? Tell me if you've got directors and officers liability insurance. Show me the strategic plan and the business plan and the board manual and the bylaws and all that stuff, so you get the chance to have a look at it and just make sure, get a sense of what it's all about. I also really encourage new board members to ask about the tone in the room and ask to be given access to the staff and the other board members to just get to know people, because in the end, a board is just a group of human beings with whom you'll either work really well or won't. And so I really encourage you to take the time that you can to get to know the individual people and ask them a lot of questions about themselves, about the organization, and about how things work, and get a feel for whether or not you think you'll be able to contribute value to the team. And, you know, if you don't get it, I spoke with a board member the other day when I was talking about this exact thing, and they said, well, I asked that and they didn't give me access. I would look at that as a pretty serious red flag. Oh, I would also ask about what formal onboarding processes they have. A lot of charities don't have, but if they do, make sure that you understand them and take as much advantage of them as you can.
Well, that's great that you brought that up, Matt, because I was going to ask you if we could flip that question around and look at it from the board's point of view. What should they be doing to onboard and orient new board members?
Yeah, good. So I think that it can be really helpful to be, on the one hand, as formal and prepared as possible. So, for example, make sure you've got as much documentation as possible about what's the organization about, how does the board function, what are our processes and structures around governance, what's a strategic plan, business plan, all that stuff. Have it ready in a package to sort of hand to somebody, because if you don't have that ready, it's going to be very hard for them to come in fully prepared. But I would also, just the exact opposite, I would be ready, I would prepare a specific approach to how you want to make sure a new board member becomes familiar with the people, with the organization, with the community, how these things work, and be really specific about what you expect from them in terms of how they prepare themselves and how they get to know everybody, because you've got the exact potential challenge that they have, which is they may be an absolutely wonderful fit, so you want to prepare them to contribute and be as successful as possible, or they may be an awful fit, and you want to make sure you give yourself the opportunity to know that right away.
That's great. And I think on that note too, I've popped a link in the chat box, but our Boards That Work course can be a good option sometimes for folks. We have a better board kit as well that can be done by the board as a team. So go check that out if you're looking for more professional development opportunities. And of course, share this webinar, because I've noticed we've had quite a few organizations sharing this as an opportunity to get their board members engaged in sort of some free professional development, which is always a good thing in the sector.
Yeah, free is really good.
Yes. So now once you've joined a board, Matt, how do you break in? So perhaps you're the newbie and there's lots of long-term directors. How do you settle into that position?
Yeah, I think the most important advice, and this, I don't know that this is special for new directors, it's just something that's important to remember in general, but can be really helpful for new directors at the beginning, is find your balance of listening, and you should definitely be listening more than talking, but find the balance of listening and participating, and get a sense for where you've got the most opportunity to add value. And this can be be patient. It takes a long time to become completely familiar with an organization and to get a feel for the people, but find those areas where you believe that you've got the opportunity to add the most value, and communicate that. We've done quite a lot of research that seems to suggest that the most important skill or trait of a board member in any sector is what we call independent mindedness. So this is somebody who has the guts to speak truth to power. It's somebody who is not too dramatically swayed by groupthink, who's willing to express unpopular opinions, who's able to introduce constructive conflict with an emphasis on constructive. And so find the ways that you can sort of nudge the board out of their comfort zone and get them thinking about new stuff. They will really, really, really value that. And I know it can take a long time, or it can seem really uncomfortable to be the new person and be thinking along those lines. But that's where you're going to be adding the most value, is in not just contributing your resume expertise, but in helping to enable the board to see challenges from as many different angles as possible.
Great. And here's another excellent question. What is the best way to find a board position if you're not on a board currently?
Um, well, I mean, there's a lot of there's. Let me just think about. I'm going to make sure that I get the list right. So, Marina, I'm going to ask you a question. Does Charity Village do any sort of posting of board positions?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that, Matt.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, we do. You can post free volunteer positions on Charity Village, and that does include board service positions. And one really great thing that we have going is a partnership with LinkedIn to post skilled volunteer positions on LinkedIn as well. So oftentimes the board volunteer positions will get cross-posted there. And then additionally, for those of you that are in Ontario, we have a partnership with CPA Ontario where they also circulate board positions posted on Charity Village to their members as well. So that can be great if you're looking especially for a treasurer. Yes, so I will put some info
Great.
in the chat box as well.
Yeah, that's perfect. And another organization where many of you have probably heard of, the Institute of Corporate Directors. That they are, it's a sort of a trade association where for corporate directors in Canada, and they have just an absolutely vast number of board postings, a lot of which are in the not-for-profit sector.
Fantastic. So lots of good places to get started with there. The last question I'm going to send to you, Matt, is about diversity. So obviously board diversity is a really hot topic in the sector with great reason. We need to work on this as a sector. What can boards be doing to optimize the diversity of their members?
Yeah, so it's an amazing question, and one that is maybe the question I get asked the most compared to any other question around boards and governance. And it's clearly a very complicated area, but I think the first thing is to I get in boardrooms frequently, and there's a lot of arguing about what diversity means, and fair enough, but I think not getting hung up on what diversity is the first question. You know, if diversity to you means having more women on the board, great. If it means ethnic or racial diversity, great. If it means people with disabilities, great. Or if it means professional expertise, fine. I think that a lot of boards waste time trying to argue about what it is. The reality is there's a vast amount of research that shows that groups made up of demographically diverse people make better decisions. So let's just get to work on it. First of all, don't get hung up on, well, we only recruit people with this particular resume background, because that's going to limit your pool of diverse candidates. Instead, focus on what are the characteristics that actually make our board effective. You may need a lawyer, you may need an accountant, but you don't need 10 of each. Let's make sure that we focus on people who are independent-minded, who are consensus builders, who are willing to challenge and introduce constructive conflict, who are willing to change their mind. None of those things are demographically linked. If you want a diverse board, recruit on the soft skills that make people good board members, and I guarantee you're going to have a pool of very diverse candidates. And this is something, if you've got more questions, email me and we can talk more specifically.
That's great. Thanks, Matt. And I just want to give a quick share from a participant who suggested a great resource, diversity.volunteerottawa.ca, which matches people from underrepresented communities to nonprofit boards in Ottawa. So
I love that. Great.
Yeah, I've popped that in the chat box as well. So go check that out. Well, thank you, Matt. This has been such a great presentation, lots of information, and we really appreciate you offering as well to continue the conversation with folks that have more questions with your email. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So I just want to remind everyone before we close today, we will follow up with you by email this afternoon or tomorrow morning with the webinar recording, the slide deck, and we'll put as many resources as we can in the follow-up email as well. If you do have further questions or there's a particular resource that was mentioned that you don't see there, feel free to drop us a line at webinars@charityvillage.com and we'd be happy to track that down for you. We will have a short survey as well that takes less than 5 minutes to fill out. We hope that you'll complete that for us if you can, and you will have an opportunity there to let us know if there's future topics you'd like to see covered. And we'll also be sure to share this feedback with Matt as well. So if there's anything that you want to give a shout out to Matt, make sure you put it in there. Our next free webinar is coming up on July 11th. We're going to be discussing the challenging issue of how to navigate workplace conflict. So there will be a link to register in the email that you receive later today or tomorrow. With that, I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and I hope that we'll see you again at a future session. Thank you.
Thanks.